I discovered that I wasn't really a designer. I learned that in the best possible way, which is I was working with some of what were at the time the world's best designers, and I was able to sort of stand back and look at them and go, "Oh, well, that's what it looks like if you're really good at this." Well, that's not me. I guess I should figure out what I'm good at. And it turned out what I really enjoyed was actually just running the business. Like running the business was the most interesting part of it to me, thinking strategically about like, what is this business? How do we grow it? How do we make it more successful? How do we understand what it actually is? You know, maybe this is also the Actlab's fault. I always start off by thinking I'm interested in the thing and itself, and then it turns out I'm much more interested in, like, I don't know, the backstage shenanigans that go on to make the thing possible.
Wikimedia Llc President Lane Becker joins the Plutopia Podcast this time. We discuss Lane's early career and his involvement in UT's Actlab program, his work in product design, AI, VR, and AR, the Institute for the Future, and all things Wiki.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Plutopia News Network. Our guest today is Lane Becker. Lane is currently president of Wikimedia Llc, and we all know that Wikimedia is part of there's a Wikimedia Foundation, there's Wikipedia, which is, I guess you would say, published by or managed by the Wikimedia Foundation. But what is Wikimedia Llc?
Hi everybody. I mean, Wikimedia LLC it's a for-profit subsidiary, basically a wholly owned for-profit entity that's owned by the Wikimedia Foundation. So it exists to do some for-profit-y type stuff, even though ultimately all the money goes back to the nonprofit.
Well, that is intriguing. I think before we talk about that some more, I'd like to talk a little bit about your history, which is a very interesting history. And we've occasionally aligned and crossed paths along the way. We know a lot of people in common, but this goes all the way back to your education when you were at the University of Texas and you were at Actlab, which was the Interactive Media Lab, which was operated by Sandy Stone, who was a professor at UT. And I was part of Backlab, which was like Friends of Actlab. I was an old fart, long graduated, but hovered around Actlab quite a bit, and that's when we met.
Oh man, we do go back. I know.
We go back a ways, yeah.
We go back. Oh, I was just a kid.
So what did you think of your experience at Actlab?
I mean, the Actlab was, I miss the Actlab. It's so funny. I still run into people now, some of whom I went to school with at the time, but some of whom were at the Actlab like before me or more often after me, because I was pretty early on. And it's still such a point of connection. Like it's such a bond. It was such a bonding moment because it was such a, I don't know, a crucible for so many folks in terms of just like forming their perspectives on the world. And it certainly did that for me. You know, I mean, so much of my life and career kind of came out of this very, very brief period of time I spent at the Actlab at UT. I mean, it still makes me sad that it doesn't exist anymore. You know, UT Austin's now got like this huge sprawling new media campus and an entire building dedicated to new media arts that didn't exist at the time when we were just in a tiny room trying to like figure out what was going on with these fun new technologies on the internet. And
but nobody really knew what new media was or was going to be at the time. It was sort of in the process of creation, right?
Yeah, I think we were still calling it multimedia at the time. South by Southwest was calling it multimedia at the time. You know, we're still doing a bunch of stuff with CD-ROMs. So, you know, it was a ways back.
Yeah, we had multimedia and interactive media.
Oh, yeah.
We actually covered the last iteration of Actlab, which was held at a local theater, and had Sandy Stone here. And Sandy's been a regular contributor to our podcast, but it was an interesting concept. It just sadly went away. That was the last time it was held, I think mainly because of COVID.
Yeah, I know. And I missed that one because I was out of town. I was so sad. And I thought at the time, oh, I'll get to it next year. And here we are 3 years later.
Yeah, we talked about doing another one. It could happen. This was it was sort of an Actlab connected, I guess you could say, mini conference. Well, it was a conference. We pulled a bunch of people together and did the kind of things that you did at Actlab. You know, there was kind of a maker element to it. There was a rowdiness to it. And there was a sense of experimentation right there, and just kind of hanging out and seeing what we could create. And that's kind of the way I always saw Actlab. It's like before Make Magazine, before Maker Faire, before any of that stuff, people were making at Actlab.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I got the confidence in my career to just sort of charge into situations and to not be afraid of new technologies and what they represented, and also to think about them critically, right? So always, I mean, that was one thing, I spent some time, talk about my career, but I spent some time and, Web 2.0 and prior to Web 2.0 in Silicon Valley and doing the startup thing. And one of the challenges for me was that environment's always so rah. Technology is going to change the world in positive ways. And that lab honestly left me with a pair of glasses that were not entirely rose tinted.
Yeah, exactly.
I was always questioning that, and it probably kept me from becoming wildly rich. But I think it also helped me maintain my ethical center, my moral core. So I feel like on balance, that's an okay trade-off.
So originally, when you sort of set out to build a career for yourself, my recollection is that you were a designer, right?
Yeah, way back at the beginning, I was like early on in the user experience design world, even before we were calling it user experience design. So I definitely got started on the design side of the house. And the one of the companies I started was a user experience design consultancy called Adaptive Path. And
which I know well. I had a lot of friends at Adaptive Path.
Yeah. And I mean, you can make a strong argument that if we didn't necessarily invent the term user experience, we were certainly the ones that popularized it and turned it from a concept into a job title.
Well, certainly Jesse's book, the elements of user experience.
Yeah, I say we, but really at the end of the day, I should probably give most of my credit to my partners in that project. I just sort of Forrest Gumped along behind them, but still, we did some cool stuff.
Well, later you became an entrepreneur and at times a management consultant and that sort of thing. Is that sort of the transition when you were at Adaptive Path and were like a founder and an owner?
I think at Adaptive Path, what I discovered at Adaptive Path, first of all, I discovered that I wasn't really a designer. I learned that in the best possible way, which is I was working with some of what were at the time the world's best designers, and I was able to sort of stand back and look at them and go, oh, well, that's what it looks like if you're really good at this. Well, that's not me. I guess I should figure out what I'm good at. And it turned out what I really enjoyed was actually just running the business. Like running the business was the most interesting part of it to me, thinking strategically about like, what is this business? How do we grow it? How do we make it more successful? How do we understand what it actually is? Maybe this is also the Actlab's fault. I always start off by thinking I'm interested in the thing and itself, and then it turns out I'm much more interested in, like, I don't know, the backstage shenanigans that go on to make the thing possible.
I'm thinking about your Twitter description of yourself: prestidigitation, double shuffling, honey fugling, horn swaggling, and skullduggery. Those are business related things, actually, as far as I'm concerned.
I actually found that in an article that was talking about I think it was an economics writer from the 20s, the 1910s, 1920s. And that was someone's description of him. That's what they said that he was good at. I was like, oh, that's a great list.
Those are great skills to have.
That's right.
Well, so you also founded a company called the Original Internet Company, correct?
Oh yeah, that was my least exciting. Well, it was fun for me. It's probably my least exciting company. I would describe that as the company where I realized that maybe I didn't want to be running companies anymore. It was kind of a mid 2010s, early 2010s attempt to kind of chase after LinkedIn, but in a way that was more oriented towards projects and people, and like being able to show your work instead of just resume up your work. And it was it was sort of that, I mean, we all have these moments where we realize that the moment has passed us, I think. And that company was it for me. I was like, oh, the way that I think about running companies and the things that I want companies to be about, like creation and invention and bringing something personally meaningful and relevant to people in the world, all that stuff that, I've thought that the internet was for ever since the Actlab. Sort of slammed into a venture environment that was far more interested in understanding like where the money is going to come from tomorrow. Thank you very much. And I was just, in this moment, I'm not feeling it. Like I can't, I know what the thing that I care about would look like to build. And I think my, co-founders on that particular project agreed with me. And then I could sort of see what the venture environment had become and what it wanted. And it was just pretty clear that there was no Venn diagram overlap between the two. That's actually the point at which I just got out of the startup world entirely and started pursuing technology work in environments that I thought were more conducive to like more of the human side of human-centered, I guess you could say.
That was a wise choice, because that was around the time when venture capital became the driving force for just about everything. It became the only reason to exist, and it kind of sucked the fun out of the things we were doing back in those days.
Yeah. Money people aren't much fun. Don't. I mean, I guess I was gonna say don't tell them I said that, but here we are on your podcast, so I guess they're gonna hear it. I mean, I'm not saying, I just, one of the things that always drove me a little crazy about Silicon Valley is I'd go to some of these parties, and this wasn't universally true. There's some great venture capitalists, just like there's some great folks and everything. But I go to some of these VC parties and I'd be like, oh, you have all this money and this is what you think a party looks like? This is terrible. It's some of the least fun I've ever had at a party. So,
yeah, I've been to some of those too. I know just what you mean. Well, you, at some point, I mean, there was kind of an interesting thing that happened to me that it sounds like you kind of got pulled into it too. In, I guess, 2005 and 6, I got involved with political uses of social technology, and also became involved with a lot of people who were like trying to figure out how to best adopt and use open source development practices and that sort of thing in the political world. And I think Code for America was kind of like that. And I see that you spent some time with Code for America. Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm talking about technology and democracy, and that's the dream. Still hard to get there, but still, honestly, still the dream. Yeah, so I spent some time at Code for America, which is as I mentioned, I kind of was like, I need to transition out of the startup universe, and I didn't know where to go. And I spent a couple of years sort of roaming, lost in the wilderness, doing consulting work and trying to find some sort of place that I could end up. And Code for America was a really happy home for a while on that front. It's a nonprofit that was trying to figure out, started in the early 2010s. And by the time I got there in the mid-ish 2010s, I think 2014, had sort of started to figure out like, how do we work with governments, right? How do we work with city governments in particular at the time to figure out how to improve the way that they use technology to serve residents, right? So how can technology be better applied to the problems of government? And doing it at the city level means things like, how do you make it easier for people to apply for a court date? How do you make it easier for people to interact with the DMV? What are the different things that you can do that just make people's lives easier through technology? Because we're interacting with government is the thing people have to do, and it can be frustrating, or it can be, I don't know if delightful is the right word, but it can be, not non-disruptive, I guess. And so how do we do that with technology? And Code for America was early on in trying to figure that out. And I loved it, because I loved working with government and this is sort of the designery side of me, but like, working for government made me realize that the way that you think about product and the way that you think about product design is like massively influenced by the set of goals, the people that you're serving, and the set of outcomes that they're driving towards, right? Or the set of stakeholders and the goals that they're driving towards. And specifically, what I mean by that is, like, I realized at that point, I've spent the last, however many, like decade plus in my career, basically working to serve one of two masters when it came to product development, and that was either subscription revenue or advertising, right? Like those were the two things that drove at base every decision that everybody made and every product that I was working on. Like, how are we going to get paid for that? And I didn't really realize that until we started doing product development work inside government, where that's not the motivation, right? And it was really fascinating to realize, like, oh, this actually, in like some I mean, it was almost like an unlearning, because it took some time to figure out, like, oh, the universe of what we can do here is different. The set of outcomes that we're driving towards is different. The way that we think about design and design processes and like design outcomes can actually be different. And like, I'll just give you an interesting example of that. Like when you're designing something for a city and you're thinking about how do we build it, right? You have to think about every single resident of that city, right? You have to think about the rich people, you have to think about the poor people, you have to think about every race, you have to think about every ethnicity, you have to think about every set of circumstances that people might be in, because everybody has to do that, right? Everybody has to, interact with the government in some way, shape, or form, deal with a court date, apply for a license, get a permit, whatever it might be, right? Like at some point, everybody in the city has some set of interactions. And that's really different from a commercial product where at the end of the day, like your design choices, they sort of like choose the set of customers that you're going to have, like you have a subset of the world, and that subset of the world, the product kind of chooses them based on whatever it is that you're trying to go for. But when you're doing it for a city, that's not the case. You have to do it for everybody. And so the way you think about understanding those users, the way that you think about interacting with them, researching them, serving them, it's just completely different, because you have a different set of inputs, a different set of outputs. I know I keep coming back to it, but it's hard not to. I will actually credit the Actlab more than any other place for, again, teaching me to think critically about this and to think about like audience and usage in a broader way. And so it really came together for me when I started to work for government, and I realized, oh, I can still do this stuff that I care about here. I can still attempt to have impact here. It's just a very different kind of impact than I was trying to have in the commercial space.
Well, when customer-facing government technologies are developed, there's often not much thought to the user experience, really. And just bringing that thinking into government is kind of a big deal, really. Did you find resistance to that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, I find resistance to good design everywhere for all sorts of interesting structural reasons, I think. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's people reasons, but mostly it's, structural reasons, it's cost reasons, it's the way that the environment was designed, it's what people consider a solved problem, it's how they think about their audiences and stakeholders, all this factors into it. But my joke, whenever designers or product people or engineers or anybody came into government and they'd be like, what do we do here? And I'm like, well, what do you want to work on? Because sort of everything's broken. Like this place is serious job security for you. Like government is so far behind where the commercial sector is because it hasn't had the same pressures to force it to compete and to improve. And so it's finally only now here, by then it was the mid 2010s starting to think that way. I had a coworker, a really brilliant man, you probably know John, named Mike Migursky. Mike Migursky was one of the founders of a really amazing early information visualization studio called Stamen. He was the CTO at Code for America at the same time that I was working there, running product. And he used to say, and I love this because remember it was 2014, I think, when he was saying this. He was like, our job is just to get most of the services we're using from like 1999 to like maybe 2007, 2008. He's like, that would be a massive sea change in terms of how it got used.
I worked on a fairly innovative application that was, I worked for government for years and was in government technology. Mm-hmm. And just a quick story. We had worked with this application for a long time, and this application was driven quite a bit by policy, and the intricacies of policy created complications within the application. And a bunch of guys came in from the outside at some point. I can't remember how they got in there, but they were just going to reinvent everything. And they had these huge smiles on their faces and talked about how basically that we, being government guys, didn't know what we were doing, but they knew what they were doing, and they were going to fix everything. And like I say, they had big smiles on their faces, and those smiles just kept falling over time as they came to realize what they were actually dealing with. They were frowning quite a bit before I think they got dismissed, actually. But that's one of the problems with some government applications. They are driven by policies that are not necessarily created with logic in mind. They're driven more by diverse interests. Diverse interests feed into policy, and you have some things that just don't kind of work very well together in the policies that are developed. And if you try to then turn those into code, it can be very distressingly complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly relate to that story. There was well, I have two thoughts on that. One is, I actually think there's so much more room for technology to contribute to the conversation around policy, both for technologists to get better and more comfortable with being involved in policy, but also for policymakers to really start to get a fundamental understanding of technology and how it can be used, and what it's good for and what it's not good for, when it's appropriate and when it's inappropriate. I ended up working for the federal government, for a branch of the federal government called 18F, 18F, not ATF, which was one of the sort of the short version is, it was like one of the spin-off arms of the Obama healthcare.gov rescue. There were a couple things that came out of that. The United States Digital Service was one of them, and 18F, which was my department, was more focused on like longer term sustainable technology transformation in government. Still exists, still doing good work. Part of an agency called the General Services Administration, which is like the back office of the federal government. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed that work, but a big part of my work there was just, people would come in with like the same thing you were talking about, John, with like these sort of starry-eyed ideas about how we were going to apply, X, Y, or Z new technology. And my job was just to say, no, that's not what we need. We need something simpler. We need to walk before we run. We need to crawl before we walk. We're not even crawling yet. And that can be frustrating for people but you sit down and I explain to them, like, no, we're not going to be able to apply artificial intelligence to solve this problem, because here are all the things that you need for a sophisticated machine learning setup. You need a data source, you need access to that data source, you need it to be normalized, you need all this stuff, right? And I was like, do we have any of those things? We do not, because the part we're on right now is just trying to get to a place where we can even produce a data set that ultimately could be used for like artificial intelligence to actually draw upon. Like, we're behind. You can't start at the end of the book. I mean, you can, but you're going to miss the whole story. The other thing, though, about that is also actually from Code for America. I worked with a lot of really wonderful folks at Code for America. That year for me at Code for America actually was not dissimilar to my time at the Actlab in terms of its massive impact on my life and career and perspective on the world. But a woman named Sid Harrell, who was the head of user research at the user experience and user research at Code for America at the time, and actually now runs the city of San Francisco's entire California digital service, for which the city of San Francisco is extremely lucky. And Sid, like Mike, is brilliant. And she used to talk about, whenever somebody would come in and say something needed to be innovative, she'd go, around here, we're into basics. Basics. Do the basics of the thing work? She's like, I'll keep half the word for you, but we're going back to basics here. And it was an interesting time. They'd expect us to show up as the people that were like those folks you were talking about. They'd expect us to show up as the people with all the flashy new ideas. And we'd be like, we just kind of want to fix the plumbing.
You mentioned AI, and that's become like the flavor of the month, of the year, with all the great predictions of what AI is going to do for us, the miracles it's going to create for us. And a lot of them have kind of turned out to be more snake oil than miracles. Do you think there's a real future for AI in things like government?
I do, actually. I just think it's going to take us a little while to get there. And honestly, we're probably going to have to get there in the commercial environment first, because to your point, a lot of what people think they can do with AI, we don't really understand how to use it very well yet, I don't think. I will say this, and I'll reference. So these days I work at this. You mentioned the Wikimedia Foundation at this subsidiary, working on a product called Wikimedia Enterprise, which we can talk about later. But one of the folks that works at the foundation that I really admire is our head of machine learning, whose name is Chris Albin, and he talks a lot about. Probably won't be able to say this as succinctly as he does, but he talks a lot about AI as a tool to improve human productivity, right? So a lot of folks who try and get into artificial intelligence, they want to use it to replace people. And he's like, artificial intelligence is not useful as a tool to replace people. Right. It's like fundamentally a nostalgic technology, right? It can only look backwards. It can only learn from things that have happened. It has no ability to predict what will happen. At best, it's going to be give you a newer, faster version of the past, not the future, right? He's like, but that can be incredibly useful. I would argue that can be incredibly useful as a tool, right? A tool for understanding where we were, a tool for improving cognition, a tool for helping be generative and creative. I think there's lots of opportunity for tools like that, tools that are designed to do what tools do, which is, allow us to extend the reach of humanity further, and ideally in positive and generative ways. But, you get people who come in and they want it to replace the entire customer service experience and let you talk to a robot instead of a person. And we've been living with those sorts of efficiency attempts throughout history, and doing it with artificial intelligence, just the latest. Yeah, or like they're painful, or they're denuded, or they waste people's time, or they sort of disrespect the person using them. You can do that with technology, but why? Like, you can do so many wonderful things with technology. Why would you pick something so crass?
Well, that's it. I think the way to think about AI is as kind of a cyborganic support system for humans, and as a
it's a good phrase for it.
Yeah, and as a partner, something that we can work with and that can support us in what we're doing, but not something that will replace the human element. I mean, human judgment is hard to replace with AI. I think I haven't seen it work.
Yeah, no, I don't think that it does. That's not that I don't think that it does work. I think sort of period, full stop, it does not work. But that doesn't mean that we can't find other ways to make use of these tools. I don't know. I think that when people forget that a machine is ultimately a tool for achieving something for people, when they think that it is instead a thing that is designed to replace people, stuff can get kind of weird.
I'm thinking about that scenario that Jake Dunnigan came up with, where the AI had been the mayor of the town, and eventually there was a law passed that said that AIs could not serve as mayors or as officials because they just didn't have the judgment for it. But you could keep them, but you had a human there who was supported by the AI system. And I think that says it right there. That's a realistic scenario to me.
Yeah, not the mayor, but maybe the chief of staff.
Another flavor of the month in technology is the metaverse. What is that going to do for us?
I mean, you tell me. This is where I go back to the Actlab, because my introduction to what we now call the metaverse 100% came at the Actlab during early attempts at virtual reality in the 90s, and I loved it then and was non-committal about its use. And but that was before anybody was trying to give it any sort of commercial application. It's the thing that's funniest to me about whenever I see, and I'll freely admit to not spending a whole lot of time on this because it's a hard eye roll for me a lot of the time. But the thing that I find most fascinating about it is just that, like, it literally hasn't progressed in any way, shape, or form in any meaningful way since the mid-90s. And when was the last time you saw a technology that people have been actively working on for 20 years that nonetheless appears to be incredibly stalled? I find that fascinating. I don't know how to explain it.
Some of the illustrations terrible.
Part of what I'm seeing in metaverse is this idea that you can shop in 3D, which you can, of course, do in a bricks and mortar store. So it doesn't really seem like that much of an innovation, except for the things that you're shopping for and picking don't look real,
Yeah.
It's just kind of catalog experience. This is from the demos that I've seen so far. I'm sure you can do. I mean, obviously in Second Life, they did really creative things with sort of a visual experience. It wasn't completely 3D, but it was similar to 3D.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sort of arguably a little more interested in augmented reality, right? Like that idea is pretty interesting to me, and particularly in like, work or industrial settings. Like that's one where I see like, okay, the value of, having this information superimposed on the world. I can absolutely see it. But then I talk to people who are actually working in AR divisions of major multinational technology companies, and they're like, yeah, it's a mess. We haven't gotten anywhere with it yet. I'm like, oh, that's fascinating. I don't know. I don't know what to do. Like there's some sort of fundamental, I don't know what it is, but like there's some sort of fundamental disconnect right now when we look at the technologies that are swirling in the hype cycle between the promises and what they can actually do. And I think we just covered two of them. Artificial intelligence is somewhat in this place, although actually there are some pretty amazing applications of it as well. And then of course crypto, which is like so far out over, it's like Wile E. Coyote off of the cliff, you know what I mean, in terms of hype. And it's just like hanging out over the cliff face, running in the air, not yet aware that it's about to plummet off. But what is it about this moment? Like, what is going on at this particular moment? What is going on with the intersection of technology and culture and commerce and capitalism, I guess, that has resulted in like this wild disconnect between what we say these technologies can do and what they can actually do? It feels like that's been the case before, but then the technology's caught up, or the technologies actually sometimes, I think, they didn't catch up exactly, but they like skated around and did something totally different, and that was cool too. But this time it just seems like, I don't know, maybe it's the money thing, but it's just
it's the era of the huckster and the grifter, I mean, we had a game show host as president for a while. We've created a kind of reality where grift is so much more acceptable than it ever was before, and even defended, as an okay thing to do and an okay way to run a government.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, I sort of fear that if anybody actually tried to pull back the curtains on capitalism, they'd realize that these days we've gotten up to about 90% grift and 10% utility, and that's not a great trade-off. And maybe you're right. Maybe technology is just the place where it's most exposed, because that's always been about like hype and the future. And so the grift is about the future's gotten really grifty, at least along that axis. Oh,
well, speaking of the future,
oh yeah,
I have this. Talk about the Governance Futures Lab.
Right. Well, so one of the other things I do in my copious free time when I'm not hanging out on stellar podcasts like this one, is I am an affiliate with the Governance Futures Lab at the Institute for the Future, which has been around since it's been around for a long time, 52, 53 years. Which is kind of like the one of their premier sort of like strategic foresight institutes / consultancies. Strategic foresight being, your listeners probably already know this, but strategic foresight just being a way of thinking about the future, multiple futures, as a way of understanding which ones are more or less appealing. That's a real TLDR on that. Governance Futures is really interesting because it's the man who runs it, you mentioned earlier, Jake Dunnigan, is just like I'm just going to keep, these people are all my friends. You all are my friends. Yeah. Just keep calling you all brilliant. That's just the deal. I have some brilliant friends, and we're running the board on them here. Jake's a brilliant guy, and really is like, thinking about like what are ways we can radically or fundamentally rethink governance. Governance just being like the way that the rules that we make for how we interact with each other, right? So not government. Governments have governance, but governance structures are about, what are the rules that we create for each other, and what are the systems that we use to create those rules, and what are the ideologies that we use to create those rules? What are the goals? What are the outcomes? What do we hope happens? What kind of spaces can we create where we don't know what's going to happen, but we hope something interesting will happen, right? And he points out that we live in I think we're here in the United States. We're experiencing how even though we really venerate our almost 300-year-old government system that is the U.S. Constitution, it's real creaky. It's really showing its age. and unfortunately wasn't designed with enough fail safes for us to move past that. It's just part of the pain that we all live with every day in this country. And Jake is like, what are some other ways we can think about governance, not just for governments, but for people? How do we think about how we govern? What would we do? It's everything from like, how would we think about governing a new colony on the moon? Right? That's one way of thinking about it too. How do we think about governance in our daily life? What's a governance system we could use for a family? What's a government system we could use for a rock band, right? Like all of these different ways that we come up with spoken or unspoken or some combination of the two rules for how they work together. It's a super interesting place. IFTF is a super interesting place. Really pretty admirable work that
I
they
agree
do.
about that. Oh yeah. Well, let's get to Wikimedia.
Oh yeah, my current
and
job.
I think
my
my first question is kind of, how did Wikimedia LLC come to be?
Okay, so the goal of it's pretty interesting, I think, right? The goal of it was to basically say, hey, so first of all, the mission of the foundation is, the dissemination of knowledge, right? Like, how can we distribute knowledge to as many people as possible in as many languages and in as many places as possible? And how can we make it as abundantly accessible as possible? That is the goal of the foundation, right? So one of the things to think about when you're thinking about it, as I often have to do from a sort of quote unquote commercial angle, is okay, how do we ensure that whatever we're doing, even when it involves commerce, even when it's about commercial transactions, how do we ensure that it's ultimately serving that mission? Right? I mean, my shorthand for this is, how do we always ensure that the money serves the mission? It doesn't turn into a situation where the mission serves the money, right? Because that can happen, right? That's the thing about capitalism. It can chew things up and spit them out real fast. So, and that's why I really like to emphasize, like, yeah, we're an LLC, but honestly, the LLC is not the important part. The important part is the part where we're all still part of the Wikimedia Foundation. Like, I'm still a foundation employee. I happen to wear a second hat as the person who is responsible for maintaining the LLC, but ultimately at the end of the day, I'm a foundation employee and I'm directed towards the mission. In the same way that whatever money that we make from the product that we sell, which is called Wikimedia Enterprise, which is generally how we refer to it, how can we ensure that all the money from that goes back to the foundation? None of it goes anywhere else. It goes back to the foundation. Some of it's used to pay our salaries because we're foundation employees. And I mention all of that just because, like, the team that came before me, and then I think with me once I joined, we really tried to thoughtfully architect the structure to ensure that at the end of the day, it was going to be about serving the mission, and that to the extent that we could, we were putting in real governors on the money making side of things to ensure that they didn't spiral out of control. So we'll kind of start there. That said, what Wikimedia Enterprise is it's basically, it came from the fact that folks who worked at the foundation really recognized that over the 20 years that Wikimedia and Wikipedia have been around, with Wikipedia and its sister projects, a lot of commercial activity has taken place, right? So over the years, we've opened up all sorts of free APIs, all sorts of free ways to access all the information, and I mean all the information. And then all the content that we create has different licenses on it, but generally speaking, those licenses are open content licenses. They're Creative Commons licenses or Creative Commons-like licenses that allow for, honestly, like, extremely flexible reuse of the data, far more than you would get in any commercial context, right? So there's a lot of commercial use of that data, right? They're all supposed to attribute it most of the time. We have a Creative Commons license that requires attribution. Some companies and organizations are better at that than others, but generally speaking, that's what they sign up for. But otherwise, they can just sort of like use the data as they will. And that's pretty important to us, actually. So what I think is interesting about that is, it created this situation where folks were like, hey, there's some like pretty massive commercial use of our content, but they don't pay. They make a lot of money off of it, but they don't pay. Some of them maybe are donors, either individually or as corporations or organizations, but they don't pay. Could we architect a system where we got them to pay, not because we were forcing them to pay, not because we said, okay, it's no longer free for you to use, which, by the way, we couldn't do even if we wanted to because of the licenses. We don't want to, just to be clear. But it's like the furthest thing from my mind. But could we could we structure it so that we could build something that looked like more like a commercial service, right? We could give them contracts that they could sign. We could give them assurances that the site would stay up. We could give them customer support. We could build maybe new features and functionality that were specific to commercial reuse. And with that, could we convince them to pay us? Right? Not because we're saying like, oh, you can't have it for free anymore, but could we architect a structure that allowed them to pay in if they chose to, and then hopefully make that appealing enough initially or over time that they start to pay in. So we're a couple years into it, and we have some customers. We've only really announced one, but it's a big one. It was Google. We announced a couple months ago. So I'm feeling good about it. Like, I feel like that's a good opening salvo in proving that the model can work, and we have a lot of cool features and functionality that we're building for commercial organizations that we think will entice more and more of them over time. And then it's great because ultimately all that money goes back to feed the Wikimedia Foundation and goes to the supporting like the production and dissemination of knowledge, which is, pretty good use for some of that money compared to some of the other things maybe these big tech companies spend it on.
Yeah, reading about Wikimedia, I noticed you have independent Wikimedia movement affiliate organizations. Mm-hmm. Now, explain exactly how that operates.
Okay, so the thing to understand about Wikimedia is that, the cool thing about Wikipedia is, as an example, as one of the projects and the best known, is that, anybody can edit it, right? You can get in there and it doesn't matter if it's Russian Wikipedia or French Wikipedia or German Wikipedia or Tagalog Wikipedia, whatever it might be, English Wikipedia. You can get in there, you can hit that edit button, you can make a change, right? Simple in concept. And then in practice, especially once you've achieved the kind of scale that Wikipedia in particular has achieved, right? Like, you need governance. Here's where we sort of pull it all together. And it's been 20 years. So like, there's some pretty elaborate governance structures. There are people that are deeply invested in it. And there are different aspects and organizations. And one of them is this notion of like regional affiliates. The actual model for this is somewhat more complicated than just affiliates, but fundamentally there are affiliate organizations. Some are actually nonprofits in their own right, and some are not. And they are specifically, they exist in different countries. The biggest one is actually in Germany, Wikimedia Deutschland, but there's plenty of other ones, Wikimedia UK, Wikimedia Netherlands, Wikimedia India, there's quite a few. And Wikimedia Japan, like, they're all over the place. And these folks, basically come up with different organizing structures on their own in a kind of a distributed manner to figure out like, what can they do? What are the goals? They have different goals, but like, what are the goals that they have? Their goals are to, and some of them work to encourage production of content. Some of them work to encourage dissemination of knowledge. Like, it's sort of as vast as the globe. I mean, that's what I love about working at this place, is there's so much and so many different kinds of activities. And then there's the foundation, which I work for, which is centralized. It's like one centralized organization that is constantly trying to figure out what is the best way to support all of this activity and all of this work. What is the best way to get resources to it? And I will say, like, sometimes the foundation does a good job of that. And like any institution, sometimes there are places where we could be doing it better, but that's kind of what it's about. It's just a recognition that this is a global phenomenon and kind of a constant ongoing widely distributed process to figure out the best way to support that phenomenon.
You've got this huge army of Wikipedians who are volunteers and who do valuable and sophisticated work, and they've evolved, principles and practices over time for doing that work to try to ensure the accuracy of Wikipedia. And I've never seen anything quite like it. How many thousands of those volunteers are there?
Yeah,
it's hard to even know.
A lot. Yeah, so many, and more people that just do it on the irregular, change a thing or two there, here or there, as opposed to the amazing folks who get in and sort of like, we'll do this, we'll manage these, particularly like these sort of elaborate content structures. Yeah, it's funny, I never really thought about this, but like the Wiki, I mentioned that like I start off thinking I'm interested in the thing, and then I always end up being more interested in the thing that creates the thing, and this has been true for my entire career. And it's sort of, I think, part of how I got involved in government, because government is, when it's working really, really well, nobody notices or even thinks about it, right? It is genuinely infrastructural in that way. And it's funny because, and then I worked in the part of government I mentioned, it's called GSA, the General Services Administration. It's like if the government is the behind the scenes actor that makes so much of the world actually work, which whether people realize it or not, it is, then like GSA is like the behind the scenes actor behind the government. It's like the support structure for the support structure. It's real back office. And I honestly, I kind of think of the Wikimedia Foundation, like, the stars of what's happening are the folks in the movement, right? They're the people that are actually doing the creation and managing the creation and creating the bureaucratic structures that organize the creation of this knowledge, right? And I think the foundation at the end of the day is kind of like, we're here to serve the movement, right? We're here to figure out how to support it where it needs supporting, and to pay for it where it needs paying for, and to do this or that to kind of keep things going. But at the end of the day, it's the same thing. It's like it's a more of a behind the scenes process. 600 or so people that are trying to figure out what they can do to support this vast universe of other folks who are doing the real work.
Yeah, the part that I love about reading anything on Wikipedia is the behind the scenes editing that goes on, and it's like watching a schoolyard fight going on, or not a fight, but an argument among people of this is the truth. No, that's the truth. Some of them are, going on and on and on. It's very entertaining.
Yeah. And I agree. I would encourage anybody who's never done it to check out a talk page, which, you can click on from any Wikipedia page and sort of see what's going on behind it. See if there've been any discussions about it. My particular favorite is I love watching people argue about like indie rock bands, just because I love indie rock bands, and it's a place where people can get passionate and involved, and sometimes people debate what should be on a page, and that makes me happy.
Yeah, the any entertainment related page has some of them are just frightening. People are really passionate about things like entertainers, to the point of sounding dangerous.
I mean, well, this is sort of why I mentioned, like, it's so impressive. I think that like the bureaucratic structures, I use bureaucratic in a positive, not a negative connotation, just in case some folks don't, but that's my take on bureaucracy. It's a form of governance, can be done well or done badly, and in this case, I'd say done well. But like the bureaucratic structures that support that sort of thing, like at the beginning of COVID, the most reliable information that you could find about what was going on with COVID was on Wikipedia, right? Because you had this army of people who were thoughtfully and carefully combing every single major source, including some of whom were very passionate amateurs, and some of whom were deeply knowledgeable professionals, coming together, sort of put all of this information in and put it through a process that actually demanded a level of verification and proof, right? That was sort of assured that the content that was going on Wikipedia around the time was like the best possible source for it. Talk to anybody who was searching the web at that time, which was every person on the planet and that had access. And ultimately all of them, Wikipedia was where they ended up. And to me, that's just like, that's amazing. I feel like it says something really critical about, I don't know, a theme that I feel like has been bubbling up our entire conversation, which is sort of like, maybe this is every conversation I've ever had, which is like, how do you use technology well, right? How do you use it? How do you put it towards its highest and best purposes? Because there's the old classic truism: technology is neither good nor bad, neither is it neutral. And I forget who wrote that. His 6 Rules of Technology in the 80s. But
that might have been Kevin Kelly.
No, it was before Kevin.
Okay.
Regardless, it's this sort of like, let's say, a fundamental law of computing, which is that what we do, what we choose to do with this matters, right? Like how we put human agency into something, what our intentions are, what our ethics are, what our values are, really, really matter. Who we care about, what we're trying to support. You can build. You can build amazing things, you can build terrible things. That's always been true. It's been true with everything. Computers just make it a little bit easier to do both at scale, right? So I guess like I kind of keep coming back to this question of like, how do we how do we ensure we do, how do we, Melvin Kranzberg, thank you.
There you go.
Fine, Melvin Kranzberg, thanks Wikipedia. way to bring it full circle there. He's a brilliant man. If you're not familiar with his work, he's a brilliant man, and his 6 laws of computing are pretty fantastic. But I like, I always come back to this, like, what can we do? How can we create governance structures that are more likely to get people to do good things? Because we've seen what bad things can happen, and I feel like the internet right now is in some ways very much just kind of like so much of the world in a little bit of a dark place at the moment, thanks to where capitalism has dragged it. And I love these moments when I get to talk to folks like you, and I get to talk to folks like the folks at Wikipedia and in the movement, Wikimedia and in the movement, who are trying to do something else.
One question about the whole big volunteer force that manages Wikipedia, are they pretty much on their own? Do they have, I mean, they're not managed at all by Wikimedia Foundation, right? They sort of self-manage.
Yeah, no, that's correct. I mean,
you don't find that many places. Yeah, that's unusual.
Yeah, it's it's community in the truest sense. I'm floored by the people that I meet that are part of that community. Like, they fascinate me. I love them.
And many companies actually bring in Wikipedians. They'll hire their own Wikipedian to sort of make sure that they're accurately represented on Wikipedia. I worked for Consumer Reports for a while, and there was a guy named Lane Raspberry that came to work for Consumer Reports, who was really very, what should I say, insightful and intelligent Wikipedian who really understood how Wikipedia works and how to make sure that it works to ensure accuracy, among other things. I mean, that's kind of the main thing there, right? You want all of that content in Wikipedia, and there's so much of it, to be accurate.
Yep. Yeah. Lane is still very much involved in the other Lane, I guess I should say. Is still very much involved in. I have yet to meet him. I'm looking forward to that. Is still very much part of the movement. Still very much a pretty critical voice inside of it.
There are people who make a living going out and changing things on Wikipedia. How do you enforce truth when you have people like that changing it to something else?
Yeah, well, I mean, truth is not necessarily the goal, right? The goal is just to ensure that there's appropriate citations, right? So that's one way that you can avoid having a conversation about truth and what is truth. That's why, so when you look at those pages, you'll see there's a real focus on things being appropriately cited. But truth is sort of left to others, which I think is actually a big strength of it has proven to be a big strength. Whether I think it is or not, I think it's pretty much proven out that it is. The movement frowns upon people getting paid not to do work around Wikipedia or the other projects at all, but getting paid specifically to edit is generally frowned upon. It's, anything gets big enough, it develops its own ecosystem, and, our universe is bigger than most. So it's got plenty of folks who build all sorts of cool things. Some of them get paid for it, some of them don't. It's just fascinating. And the foundation is sort of, again, here to support it. Whatever direction it goes, the foundation's here to support it.
Well, I mentioned companies hiring Wikipedians. In the one situation where I knew somebody who was in that role, they were not there to change things for the company. They were just there to manage the way the company was presented. But I wonder if Wikipedians who hire themselves out to do that sort of thing, and if they misuse their role in order to do that sort of thing, they're kind of called out by other Wikipedians, right? They keep an eye on each other.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't an area where I have a lot of expertise, full disclosure, but I mean, I would say, like, it is a community. It operates like a community. People pay attention to each other, and they hold each other to, standards and expectations as part of that. And absolutely, like any community, there's forms of self-governance, or communities, I should say. At the end of the day, it's really not one community, it's many communities, right? There's different rules and norms that govern the different projects. There's even different rules and norms that govern the different Wikipedias, so how things get decided on Russian Wikipedia is a little bit different from how things get decided on Dutch Wikipedia.
No, I imagine.
So, many different communities, and different communities have different ways of structuring sort of policing mechanisms. And, and then there's some things that they work with a foundation. So the foundation has put together, through a very long and somewhat arduous process, has put together something called the Universal Code of Conduct, which is making its way towards ratification, trying to enforce some baseline rules and mechanisms for how people are expected to behave. So, it's not like the foundation's uninvolved, but even then it sort of tends to be something ideally that bubbles up from activity in the movement, not something that's imposed on the movement, though certainly there are folks in the movement who would disagree with the statement I just made. Because honestly, it's big enough that there's always someone to disagree with you. That's part of its charm.
I think we're pretty close to the end of our hour. Do you have anything else to add, especially about kind of what you're hoping to do in the near future in your role at Wikimedia?
That's a good question. I find this whole process of trying to figure out how to build a commercial service for commercial companies that doesn't violate either the spirit or the letter of the law when it comes to the foundation and its mission to be just a really interesting challenge and a tightrope to walk at times. But I feel like we're doing a pretty good job of it so far. But I find it very, I find it very animating. I'm animated by the concept of ultimately of fairness that sort of sits behind it. This idea that, like, if you're making some money off of the content, that if we could build a mechanism to feed some of the money that you're making back into the movement, that, sort of initially, it's almost a virtuous circle, right? Like, I mean, big tech company pays money to get better access and to the service so that they can get the content. That money goes back to create more content and disseminate it more.
Thank you, Lane, for joining us. This has been a great conversation, and we'd love to have you back sometime to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we can come on with one of those many cool folks that we just discussed.
That's a great idea.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's do that.
Love it. Cool.
Okay, well, thanks so much.
Thanks, folks. I appreciate it.
We'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.
Bye, gang.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.